The VIC-20, introduced in 1980, was a great machine for learning to program and for playing games. Now, I've covered it before from a historical perspective, but ever since I really learned how to code for it in assembly language, making such games as Petsky Robots, for example, I have really felt that the VIC-20 was really capable of more than what we ever got from it. So I want to have a look at it again from a hypothetical alternate universe type of angle, basically to ask the question, what if? Now let's talk about some of the things in our prime timeline that held it back, and I'd say beyond any doubt the introduction of the C64 2 years later somewhat overshadowed the VIC, and certainly all of the programming talent went to that platform. And with the default 5K of RAM, I think that was the only other major limiting factor. Games on cassette or floppy disk had to typically fit in about 3K of RAM. They were just never going to be that great. The most cartridge games were either 8 or 16K, and thus still didn't have a lot of room to work with, and despite having a decently capable disk drive, virtually no VIC-20 software was ever distributed on disk. That's why most of the games, even the better games on the system, rarely had things like a nice intro screen. Omega Race, for example, was one of the few games to have an intro screen, and it was really just a small static logo so it didn't take up much ROM space. And virtually no VIC-20 games have any sort of in-game soundtrack. I mean, sure, you get things like Donkey Kong or even Radar Rat Race, but these are just very short tunes, usually played with a single voice and repeated ad nauseum.
So the question I want to propose is this. What if Commodore never came out with the C64, but instead bumped the VIC-20 up to its maximum RAM?
This would have allowed disk games to be much larger. And remember, with disk-based games, they can even be larger than this because you can always swap in extra code or graphics as needed from the disk drive. And there's no real design changes here. This is something any user could have done even back in the day with a RAM cartridge. But because it wasn't standard, it wasn't really supported by much of anything.
So imagine a world where the VIC-20 was still Commodore's flagship product, and games started appearing on disks instead of cartridges and using the full RAM capabilities. What would that have looked like?
Let's revisit the music issue. The VIC-20's sound capability was actually pretty awesome for the time. It's unfortunate that games never had enough RAM or ROM to store cool soundtracks, but let's explore what that could have been like. This is just an automated conversion of the Super Mario tune over to the VIC-20. But nevertheless, it shows you could easily have Nintendo or Game Boy style musical soundtracks. Now, this would have been way cooler than anything you'd get on an Apple II or an IBM PC or even a Sinclair Spectrum. And if you look at some of the demos released for the VIC-20 over the years, you can see it was possible to eke out a little more variety of sounds out of the system. Even 5 years later, the VIC-20 would have still been better than most of its competitors in the sound department. Okay, so the graphics on the VIC-20 are a bit chunky. It's roughly half the resolution of the C64. However, it's not quite as big of a hindrance as you might think. And if you wanted to toy with the idea of converting games from other platforms, there are a few ways to look at it. So here's the horizontal resolution of the C64 in both high-res and multicolor. The VIC is roughly, but not quite, half of that in both modes. Multicolor on the VIC is especially difficult to use because of how large the pixels are. And then there's the Sinclair Spectrum, which had 256 pixels across and no multicolor mode. Most C64 games ran in multicolor mode, and thus it's pretty easy to convert those graphics to monochrome and then display them as high-res on the VIC-20. Or take a look at how the game was made on the Sinclair Spectrum and then figure out a way to crop the image some, and those graphics would work on the VIC-20. Also, the VIC chip can be configured to display a bit wider image, giving you 200 pixels, which means you're not losing that much screen real estate over the Spectrum version of the game. So let's take a look at a few examples of games that would have been totally possible. So this is a screenshot from Spy vs. Spy on the C64. It runs in multicolor mode. And I took this into a paint program and converted it mostly to monochrome, but as you can see, this would be totally compatible with the VIC-20's video system. And by having the playfield areas in monochrome, you can use software sprites that would avoid any color clashing over the color cells. I think this would have been very playable. Now, the music you're hearing is from the Atari ST, which I think would sound slightly different, but otherwise pretty similar on the VIC-20. Likewise, this is how the game looked on the Sinclair Spectrum, which would have had similar limitations. Okay, here's another one, International Karate. Again, we have a multicolor game, and I think the easiest way to get this working would be to modify the graphics to be mostly black and white like this, and then I believe it'd be possible to bring back some of the color to the top portion of the screen using the multicolor mode, which could look like this. And again, the music you hear is from the Atari ST to give you an idea of how it would sound. And here's the Sinclair Spectrum version, and as you can see, they took a similar approach here. And what's even more interesting is after working on these drawings, I actually found a YouTube video where a guy was working on exactly such a port for the VIC-20, and this is how far he got. This was just a proof of concept, but it looks like he was taking more or less the same approach I was thinking, and I think this proves beyond any doubt that such a game could exist for the VIC-20, and it would have been awesome. Okay, so here's a couple more. This is Ghosts and Goblins on the C64, or at least the intro screen. And again, there's two ways to approach this conversion. We could start by taking the C64 graphics and converting them to monochrome. Again, I had to touch this up some to make it look decent. And then you could go in and use the color cells to shade various parts of the screen different colors. Now, if you're doing this image from scratch, you'd probably want to move some things around on the screen so that objects better aligned with the color cells. And with that approach, I think this could look even better, but you get the idea. It doesn't look half bad. Alternatively, if you wanted to go with the VIC-20's multicolor mode and sacrifice even more resolution, then it could look like this. And this doesn't look too bad either. Again, the music is from the Atari version. And here's Impossible Mission on the C64. Now for this one, I went with multicolor, and I had to touch up some of the details by hand, but everything looks pretty good except for the player character. So in order to get any detail there, I think you'd have to go with high res, which means color clashing. So I took the same approach as the Sinclair Spectrum version, and I used the black and white artwork from that, and I think that would work pretty well. By the way, since the VIC-20 doesn't have a true bitmap mode, you can totally mix high-res and multicolor graphics on the screen together like this. That's something you actually cannot do on the C64. And then there's this. Somebody was toying with porting Gianna Sisters over to the VIC-20. This is as far as they got, but still pretty cool.
Okay, so now I've shown you some hand-drawn mock-ups that I made, but why don't we take a look at some actual games that have been created in the modern era for the VIC-20? I think you're going to be surprised at some of the things that the VIC-20 can actually do.
The first game I want to show you came out in 2004. It's called Astronel. Now, this game isn't necessarily going to blow your mind on the VIC-20's capabilities, but it may blow your mind to know that it fits in 3K of RAM, and thus runs on a stock VIC-20. But everything else I'm about to show you requires a RAM upgrade. Here we have Hero. This was a popular game on many systems of the 1980s, however the VIC-20 never got a port of this game back in the day. It has a great intro screen with a musical score, and of course, here's the game itself. It plays absolutely fantastic. It's not as graphically rich as the C64 version, but it's easily as good as the Atari 2600 port. Here's another game that never made it to the VIC-20 back in the day, Pitfall. Now, this game plays fantastic, and I'll make the same observation as with the last game. It's not as graphically rich as the C64 version, but matches the Atari 2600 version. Here's a relatively new game called Lala Prologue. It kind of feels like Money on the Run or something of that nature. This game is good for illustrating a common design concept used for the VIC-20, and since there are no hardware sprites, the software-generated sprites typically need to be monochrome, and any part of the screen they touch also needs to be monochrome so that you don't have clashing of the color cells. Now, this was a common theme in the Spectrum games for the same reason. But you can sprinkle in color in places the sprites won't go. Now, in this game called Get More Diamonds, they took a little bit different approach. The player sprite simply takes on the color of the environment it's drawn over, so if he's over the trees, he's green, if he's climbing up a vine, then he's yellow, etc. And that works okay for this game, and it definitely allows a bit more color. Okay, let's take a look at the original Frogger on the VIC-20. It wasn't exactly a spectacular port, but recently a new port of Frogger came out for the VIC-20, and let's just say it's a bit better. It has a nice intro screen with a nice musical score, and the game itself runs in multicolor mode. This unfortunately makes the pixels enormously chunky, but it does give the flexibility to move sprites around on the screen without color clash. Speaking of new ports, here's the old Qbert. This was probably the worst port of Qbert for the 20 plus platforms it was ported to. Again, no effort was really made to use any kind of software sprites. And here is a newer version. Now, this runs in multicolor mode and uses software sprites. It's graphically quite a bit better than the original. Now, here's one that'll blow your mind, Prince of Persia. This came out just recently. It's really amazing such a game can even run on the VIC-20. This game runs in high-res mode and takes the monochrome approach with a little color sprinkled in here and there, but it does allow the main character sprite to blend in and animate well. And while the graphics aren't going to necessarily wow you, the game is completely playable. And here's an interesting game. As far as I know, this is the only scrolling platformer on the system. Cheese and Onion runs in multicolor mode and uses the same 4 colors for every tile on the screen, making it possible to move the sprite around seamlessly. But it does look pretty chunky. Still, it's a pretty neat game. Okay, here's one I've shown before. It's called Realms of Quest, and it's an RPG style game, and it uses a mix of high-res and multicolor. And some of the graphics are remarkably good. It's probably the most complex game on the system. I've tried playing it a few times, but the learning curve was too steep for me. But there's now a somewhat simpler and more familiar RPG on the system, Ultima 3. This was just recently ported, and while Ultima 3 was never really known for having incredible graphics, this version looks remarkably like the C64 version. What's more interesting is how it sounds. The music is actually being generated more by the CPU than the sound chip, and thus how they are getting that more sawtooth type sound than what you'd typically expect on the VIC-20. This port is truly remarkable. Next up is a new racing game called Formula V20. It's a game somewhat similar to Pit Stop on the C64, and similarly you can pull over to the pit and change out tires or refuel. And this is Pentagorat. It's an isometric sort of game where each room is a puzzle, and even though the graphics are monochrome, they look amazing for the VIC-20. Now, this is the sort of complexity that just wouldn't have been possible with the stock RAM on the original system. This one is called Cheesy Trials. It's a fun little game where you play a mouse in a maze. It also runs in monochrome, but the screen is always changing color, thus giving you an illusion that the game has color. The VIC-20 also got a pretty decent version of Tetris back in 2006. It has a great soundtrack and plays really well, but it only uses a 3K RAM expander. I think with full RAM, this game could easily have some awesome background graphics too, and I've done a mock-up here to show an example of what that might have looked like. Okay, I have 2 more games to show. This is Tenebra Macabre, and it's another platformer similar to Lala Prologue that I showed earlier, although this one is insanely hard. And last but not least, we have Doom. This has a great soundtrack, and unfortunately it runs in a small window of like 32 by 64 pixels, and you get something around 2 or 3 frames a second. It's sort of playable, but you probably won't want to spend a huge amount of time playing this, but it is still a really cool concept.
There are also some documented cases, for example in the game Jack Attack, where a VIC-20 version was actually produced but never released because Commodore said that the C64 version wasn't significantly better, and they wanted to give people an incentive to buy the Commodore 64.
So I think there's some degree of blame on Commodore themselves for the VIC-20 not achieving more than it did. And I know a lot of people look at these older game systems and they think that the graphics or sound systems were the most important thing for making better games. But I think a lot of people really underestimate how much of a role memory played. I mean, for example, even if you took an Amiga and crippled it to 8K of memory, the games wouldn't really wind up looking any better than an Atari 2600. And that's because graphics, music, and sound effects all take up space, and without larger memory areas to store all of that, the game simply wouldn't look any better. And so that brings me to another interesting point. Even the Nintendo had a limit of 32K for code and 8K for graphics, meaning the upper limit for a cartridge game like Super Mario Bros. Was about 40K. Interestingly enough, was also the upper limit for the VIC-20. But later on, Nintendo started adding mapper or banking systems to their cartridges, and so, for example, Super Mario Bros. 3 is almost 10 times as large as the original, and this is reflected in the game itself. Not only is the game vastly more complex, but it has a ton more animation, and the musical scores also include a lot of PCM samples to make more realistic sounding instruments. There's absolutely no reason this couldn't have been done on the VIC-20 cartridges as well, and the VIC-20 could have had massively complex games like the Nintendo had, all without the hassle of long loading times from discs. Now, let's not delude ourselves. The Nintendo still had an edge in graphics and color resolution, especially with its hardware sprites. So VIC-20 games wouldn't have been quite as good graphically, but I'm convinced that with the required memory, most any game that was done on the C64 or Nintendo could have been done, perhaps to a lesser degree, on the VIC-20.
And while you're chewing on that, just imagine for a moment there's also no reason why the Commodore 64 could not also have had banked cartridges just like Nintendo. Chew on that for a moment. But otherwise, that's all for this episode. So as always, thanks for watching.
Thank you.